In a recent blog post on Bounteous.com, we took a look at how to manage Drupal entities through webhook notifications. This video provides a walkthrough of that topic. We'll begin by taking a look at what webhooks are and how they differ from the traditional polling of APIs that you might be used to. We'll examine how Drupal 8 and 9 are capable of consuming webhook notifications using readily available components included in core. We'll take a look at an example code and module structure that's found in the example module referenced in our blog post. We'll also review the required tooling and content necessary in order to work with webhook notifications, and finally step through an actual working example by installing the sample module from our blog post and setting it up in a live Drupal site. So how do webhooks differ from polling an API? We make an analogy in our blog post and look at polling APIs as being akin to something like a daily check-in with a friend, where you find out what's changed since you last spoke. So in some instances, they'll have a slow day, and they won't have many updates to share, but others will be completely full of news. And either way, you're going to get a complete rundown of what happened in the 24 hours since you last spoke, all in one fell swoop. Webhook notifications, on the other hand, are much more like a friend who is going to text you throughout the day and give you a heads up when you need to know that something has happened. So the frequency, urgency, and length of their messaging will vary from day to day. You're always going to receive those updates on a rolling basis, and at least in theory, only when there's something that they feel you need to know. So what does that look like with Drupal, and how does it translate to actually implementing webhooks? We have a side-by-side comparison here, taking a look at some of the higher level points and the way that webhooks might differ from what you're used to working with when making API calls. First of all, unlike an API call, a webhook notification is initiated by the third-party provider who is actually storing the data that you'll be consuming. They do roll in on an ongoing basis, and so unlike a traditional API call, it's unlikely that they're going to be arriving on a set schedule. You're not going to necessarily be setting up a cron task to go and retrieve webhook notifications because they are dispatched to your Drupal site rather than being requested by it. Notifications are always real-time, and so as soon as a change occurs in a provider's system, that webhook notification is dispatched. And so unlike with a traditional API call, you're not receiving all of the updates in a single batch. And finally, these are also typically going to be aggregated for bulk processing at a later date. So unlike a API call where you may set up a cron task, retrieve the data, and then act upon it as soon as it arrives, we're going to propose taking a little bit different approach with webhooks and queuing them up so that we can address all of them en masse at a later time. As with choosing between any two technologies, there are some advantages and disadvantages to webhooks when compared to API polling. We've already covered the fact that they arrive in real time. The nice thing about that is it does give you the choice of acting upon them. Whether or not that's a good idea, we'll discuss a little bit later. You will only ever receive and process relevant changes when you're working with webhooks. So unlike an API call where you're blindly reaching out to a third-party system and asking them for a data set, you're pretty much guaranteed that when a webhook notification arrives, it represents something that is important and that you want to act on. Because of that, it's also much more efficient to work with webhooks. All the processing is dedicated to something that you actually need to do, and you're not constantly stepping through the motions of retrieving a data set that may or may not contain changes. On the downside, processing of webhooks on a rolling basis, if you do decide to opt to do that, could potentially impact site performance. If a large batch update occurs in the third-party provider's system and your Drupal site's inundated with notifications, you may not want to necessarily act upon those, especially if they occur during a time of peak traffic. One downside to no webhook notifications that you don't typically encounter with polling APIs is that if your provider goes offline or stops delivering notifications, you really have no way of knowing that that's occurred. No news is essentially no news with webhooks, and so if notifications aren't rolling in, your Drupal site, for all intents and purposes, is assuming that there's nothing going on. The other downside to that is that a missed notification typically can't be retrieved or resent. So unlike an API call where you can make a second call if the call failed or make that call again at a later date, notifications are kind of more of a one and done setup where once they're broadcast, they're out and gone and won't be triggered again unless an identical change is made in the provider's system. And finally, there are some additional security concerns to be aware of, namely that because content's being posted to an endpoint on your Drupal site, it is theoretically possible for someone to spoof your provider and inject code through a notification that looks like it's legitimate where it actually isn't. So we'll talk a little bit later about how to mitigate that in this video. For a more detailed rundown, definitely check out the blog post on Bounteous.com. When it comes to consuming webhook notifications in Drupal 8 or 9, there are a few things to be aware of. For starters, there's no dedicated core API that you can leverage out of the box. So you're not going to be able to write a plugin or hook into an existing system. You're generally going to need to roll your own module in order to work with webhooks. There are some available contrib modules that the community has built. However, a lot of them currently have fairly low usage and often focus more on enabling Drupal to broadcast its own webhook notifications to other systems, more so than receiving them, which is really our focus in this video. There are a handful of contrib modules that you can take a look at and reference, which also may or may not fit your use case, but they are capable of consuming webhook notifications. A great example we've listed here is the PayPal for payment module, which relies on webhook notifications from PayPal to be told that a payment is successfully processed, for one example of how this would be implemented. Now, despite the fact that you can't just get up and running by turning on a module that's in Drupal core or a contrib module, the good news is that all the required components for actually rolling your own webhook notification listener and processing the payloads it receives are available in core. So let's take a look at what's actually involved in assembling a custom module to consume webhook notifications in Drupal. The structure contains the sample code from our example module referenced in the blog post and hosted on GitHub. So if you haven't already downloaded it, I'd encourage you to do so. But we'll start out with the .routing.yaml file, probably the most important piece of the webhook, since all notifications need to be posted to an endpoint on your receiving Drupal site. We've set up a simple path here that lives at /webhook entities/listener. Fairly common routing definition. The one piece to notice here is that we do have a custom access handler defined, and we'll take a look at that in a moment, but we do need to rely on this access method in order to ensure that all the notifications we're receiving are from a legitimate source. While not strictly necessary, we've also created a configuration form that allows us to manage an authorization token. This is going to be the authentication method that we rely on. It's probably the most common approach that you'll see for authorizing webhook notifications. Typically, this is going to correspond to something like an API key or another secret provided by your third-party provider that only you and they know about. And this is how we ensure that all of the incoming notifications that arrive at the Drupal site are actually legitimate. In our case, we've built a simple text field where we capture that authorization token as a string. Once those two pieces are in place, we can actually create the authentication logic to compare the incoming webhooks and their authorization token against what we have stored locally in Drupal. In this case, we're going to do that in our controller. And we actually have a method that's been created called access. It's very straightforward. We take a look at the incoming notification, and since the authorization is typically found in the header, we do pull that value out of the request header. We then retrieve the stored token from Drupal config and compare the value of those two variables to ensure that they match. If they do, we proceed to allow access to the controller. Our controller does contain one other method that's simply called listener. It corresponds to the endpoint that we defined in the routing file. And it's also very straightforward. Essentially, all we're doing here is returning simple response, which would equate to a 200 code, letting the provider know the notification is received. We would then pull the actual content, the body of the notification out. This is typically going to be a JSON payload, as we'll see in a moment. And once we have that, we actually hand it off to a Drupal queue. So we rely on a queue factory to store the incoming payload so that we can act upon it later. We're not actually doing anything with it at this point. So the controller is really just receiving the notification and handing it off so that we can process it at a later time. There's going to be a bit more going on in our queue worker, which is found in our plugin folder of our custom module. We do have a primary process item method that is going to examine the payload and start out by determining whether or not we should act on it. So going back to that notion of efficiency with webhook notifications, we assume that these are only received when something happens that we need to respond to or act on. In this case, we're going to ensure that the payload received is not empty. Simple check to start things out. Once we've done that, we'll decode the payload from JSON into a PHP object so that we can work with it more easily within Drupal. The next step is a check that is kind of specific to this example, but because we're managing entities in Drupal, we want to ensure that our payload, that our notification contains something that can be used as a UUID. And that's because we need to have a way to map the incoming data from the notifications to a specific entity within Drupal. We want to make sure that each one is unique. And this is going to especially come into play as we start modifying existing entities in Drupal. So we ensure that that value is set, which we'll take a look at later as well in our payload. The next step is kind of focused on security. So we want to remove any values that we won't be using. This isn't strictly necessary because if we don't act on the incoming data, it shouldn't be an issue. But out of an overabundance of caution, here we've provided an example for unsetting some unused values from the payload and ensuring that those don't even get passed off to the CRUD worker that we're about to call. And then finally, the next piece that we want to address before working with the entities themselves is determining whether we have a Drupal entity that already exists corresponding to the incoming notification. So in this case, we rely on a service that's been built, a custom service that's called Webhook UUID Lookup. It's very straightforward, but all we're going to do here is receive a UUID from our payload and run a query to determine if we have an entity that corresponds to that UUID, if it exists in the field for a specific entity. If we do, then we return the match and let the rest of our logic know that we have something to work with. If not, we return false. So returning back to that queue worker, we'll then act on another aspect of the payload, which is the event value. So we have 3 events that we're going to be working with in this example. There's a create event, an update event, and a delete event. For the create event, we handle this one a little bit differently. We first ensure that we do not have an existing entity. And so that's where our check comes into play. If we don't, we can handle this off to our CRUD worker and go ahead and generate a new Drupal entity and node. If we do find that there is an existing entity, we're going to throw an error so that we can log that and determine why it's attempting to create a duplicate entity. The other two events, the update and delete, are going to be handled in a bit of a different manner. In this case, we want to ensure that there is, in fact, an existing entity as returned by our custom service. And if there is, we're going to go ahead and call two different methods of our CRUD worker and pass along that existing entity itself, as well as the command, and in the case of updating, any new entity data that needs to be modified. And the remainder of our queue worker just contains some additional logging so that we can track when it fails and when there's an issue with the data. Finally, the other main piece to our puzzle is a CRUD worker. And that has also been built in our example module as a custom service. And if we take a look at what's going on there, it's pretty straightforward in terms of the logic, but we essentially have a class that contains three different methods. One is for creating a new entity, one is for updating an entity, and one is for deleting an entity. And what these do actually is map the incoming data in the payload that's received from the webhook notification to Drupal fields. And so we can see here in the create method, we are mapping we're indicating that we're going to create a basic page. We are mapping our UUID to a field that we'll be creating shortly within Drupal so that we can capture that UID and allow it to persist. And then in this particular case, we're calling a little bit of a helper method at the bottom of this class where we rely on some additional logic to map the payload data into Drupal fields. So really the goal of this is to assemble an array of node values that can be used and handed off to the entity type manager create method and provide Drupal with a format that it's expecting in order to generate a new node and populate those fields with values. The update method is very similar. So we're simply going to be checking the incoming payload and determining which values are present and need to be modified. Here, we're simply working with a title and a body. If we detect that those are coming in from the notification, we'll go ahead and update the existing entity. If not, we just simply ignore it and don't make any changes. And the delete method is even simpler. We effectively just call the delete method on the entity type manager. So now that we've taken a look at the actual code base and what that might look like when it's implemented, let's talk for a minute about the required tooling and content that you'll need in order to actually work with webhooks. The first item, probably the most obvious, is a data provider that would actually dispatch notifications to you. It's certainly not given that anyone who provides an API will also offer webhooks, but the fact that that's required probably led you to this video in the first place, so you may or may not already have this in place. If you don't worry about it. Our example shows a way to sidestep that if you'd like to experiment with webhook notifications, and also provides a way to facilitate local development when it can often be difficult to allow a provider to hit your environment on your own personal machine. The next item that's required is some sample or even actual notification data. Again, we'll be providing an example of some sample notifications that can be used for testing. It's possible to also capture an example of some actual data and use that, which is in most cases advisable when you're looking to develop against a specific webhook API and follow the data structure that will ultimately be sending to your production site. The next item would be a publicly accessible Drupal site, probably also pretty obvious, but there's again that catch that you may or may not have an environment set up where you can play around with the example shown here. And if you are working locally, it's going to be difficult to open that up. So we won't actually touch on that just yet. Instead, we'll be looking at an alternative approach using Postman. The next item and final one is not strictly required for working with webhooks, but something that we want to touch on here because we are going to be manipulating Drupal entities, and that is the UUID that was previously mentioned while we were looking at the code base. And so we want to ensure that there's some unique piece of data within our webhook payloads that can be tied to each record that is going to be created in Drupal and corresponds to an item in your third-party provider system. The two need to be mapped together. And so if there isn't anything like this, a file name or a unique identifier that is pulled from the database and added to the notification, you may need to do some additional legwork and, for example, concatenate some values together that would serve as this reliable and unchanging identifier for future use. All right, enough of the fun part. We'll take a look at an actual working example using the sample module that's included and referenced in our blog post. So you're obviously going to need a Drupal site to try this out. If you haven't already provisioned a development environment or stood up a local site to work with, go ahead and do that now. You'll also need to get a hold of that example module that can be found at the URL seen on your screen and downloaded from GitHub. Once it's enabled on your Drupal site, you can then move on to installing the Postman app. Now, this is a utility that we'll be using in order to broadcast webhook notifications locally. It essentially allows us to sidestep the entire process of finding a provider and allowing them to post notifications to our local site, which comes with its own headaches, including making that site available on the internet since it just lives on a local computer. Once Postman's installed, you can then go ahead and import our example collection. The name of it is found on your screen. And we also provide a link here for importing that data. And getting that collection into Postman will actually create the templates for the sample notifications that we want to go ahead and broadcast to our local site. So take a moment to pause the presentation and get all these steps set up, because as we move on, I'll already have them in place. I'm already logged into my local Drupal site. So in order to get started, I'm first going to navigate to structure, content types, and I'm going to manage the fields for my basic page content type. What I want to do over here is create a new field that's going to be for our webhook UUID, that unique value that's arriving in the payload, which we need to capture and track for recalling entities and acting on future notifications. So you want to go ahead and create a new plain text field. It's going to be given the name webhook_UUID. So your final resulting name should be field_webhook_UUID. And then go ahead and save your changes so that this field now exists on our basic page content type, which will be what we're using to create nodes resulting from the incoming webhook notifications. The next thing that you'll want to do is navigate over to the page at /admin/config/webhook_entities/settings. And this is that configuration form that we had taken a look at in the code base. So this is where we're going to capture our authorization token. And in this case, we're just going to use an extremely simple example. So I'm going to jump back over to Postman and take a look at the way this collection is set up. If I look at one of our notifications and I examine the authorization setting, this is actually managed globally for the Postman collection. So you don't need to change it, but we can open that up and see that it's been configured to use an authorization key of 123456, and that is being added to the header. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that value and then jump back over to Drupal and insert it as our authorization token. If we don't do this, then every notification that is delivered to Drupal is going to be rejected and fail because it is not matching what is being delivered in the headers of the notifications. And the next thing that you'll need to do is return to Postman again and take a look at each of the three of these notifications that have been included in our sample collection and pay special attention to what's included up here in the URL for the post action. So this already corresponds to my local development environment, but you can see here I have my webhooklog.lando.site URL. You're going to want to make sure that whatever is contained here in Postman is being used for your notification matches the root domain and base URL of your own site. So go ahead and jump over to Drupal, copy whatever URL that your local development site lives at, and paste it in, ensuring that you maintain the /webhookentities/listener endpoint that's defined in our routing.yaml file. Do that, go ahead and save each notification and make sure you update the create node, the update node, and the delete node notifications before moving on to the next step. Once that's done, we can go ahead and take the custom module for a test drive. So we'll start out by attempting to create a node. If you select this notification and click the big blue send button, you should see a delay of a few seconds and then a response. And you'll note that this message here is notification received, corresponds to what we had put in our controller method for the listener, and we have a 200 status, so it means it should have posted. The way that we found is easy to validate that is to drop into a terminal and rely on Drush in order to see if the notification has been received and queued. So we'll say queue list in order to display what's going on in Drupal. And here we have our webhook entities processor queue. It's telling us that there's a single item that's been queued up and we should be good to go. So we can go ahead and process that item by running cron. And we don't see any errors. It actually tells us that node 1 was created to represent the webhook entity, and 09876 is our UUID. If you're curious about any of this data that's being sent over to Drupal, you can actually jump back into Postman and take a look at the body tab. And that's where you'll find the JSON objects that's being delivered over to Drupal in the payload via the webhook notifications. All right, so for the moment of truth, we'll go ahead and jump back to Drupal and take a look at our content listing page. And lo and behold, we do have a new node that's been created. It tells us the node was created from a webhook notification. We'll take a look at that. And it just has some simple body text and a webhook UUID that we'd seen in the payload. So it looks like everything is working. We can go ahead and finish stepping through the process of examples by returning to Postman and trying to post our update notification. We'll take a look at the body really quick to see what we're expecting. Looks like the title is going to be modified and the body text is going to be updated as well. You'll recall that in our CRUD manager, we had a method for update, and it was essentially moving through each of these items and checking to see if they exist and if they're present, acting upon them. So we'll go ahead and send this to Drupal by clicking the blue button. Again, notification has been received, and we have a 200 status, so we can return to our terminal, and we'll run queue list again. Should see one item because the prior one was already processed, which we do. So we'll go ahead and run cron, and it tells us that node 1 has been updated. We'll confirm that by going back to Drupal and reloading the page. Note the title. This node was created from a webhook notification, so we'll go ahead and refresh the page, and our change has been affected. So here the node is updated by webhook notification. Great. Well, we'll go ahead and try out the final sample notification provided in the collection, which is the delete node. I'm sure you can guess what that's going to do once we hit the send button. Received once again. Go ahead and confirm that the queue is populated, which it is. Run cron, and the node was deleted. So we'll jump back to Drupal and list our content, which should be empty. So at this point, you should have just about everything you need to work with webhook notifications in Drupal. In conclusion, you're more than welcome to leverage the example code that we reviewed in this video as a starting point for any of your future projects that warrant consuming webhook notifications in Drupal. Before you do so, you might want to check out the original blog post that inspired this video. We actually have some additional information there talking a little bit more in depth about security considerations and other issues you might encounter working with external data side by side along with user-generated content in Drupal. While on bounties.com, definitely take a look at some of our other great Drupal-related blog posts. You can filter by platform. We have a lot of great thought leadership pertaining to Drupal and various Aquaware products. And of course, reach out to our team at any time if you have questions or would like to work for us. Thanks for watching.